The moment Nora Atwood stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the dry autumn of 1878, she did so with a split lip, a carpetbag that held everything she owned in the world, and the desperate, bone-deep certainty that if Reverend Elias Croft ever found her again, she would not survive the finding. The town of Caldwell sprawled along the edge of the Cherokee Strip like something half-built and already half-forgotten, a collection of sun-bleached storefronts, a livestock pen that stank magnificently, and two saloons operating within 50 yards of each other, as though in direct competition for the soul of every cowhand who rode the Kishom Trail north. Dust moved through the main street in lazy spirals, and the late afternoon sun threw everything into shades of copper and amber that might have looked romantic to someone who was not standing in the middle of it with bruised ribs and nowhere to go. Nora pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, not because she was cold, but because the shawl covered the fading handprint that still sat purple and yellow along her collarbone. She had been on the road for 11 days. Before that, she had spent 3 years in the household of Reverend Elias Croft of Wichita, first as a parishioner he had taken under his wing after her parents died of fever, then as something he called his ward, and then, when she had dared to speak back to him in front of the deacons, as something he called ruined. The word had followed her like a shadow ever since. He had stood at his pulpit and delivered it like a verdict from the Almighty himself, his voice rolling through the pews with all the terrible authority of a man absolutely certain that God agreed with every syllable he uttered. He had told the congregation that Nora Atwood had a rebellious spirit, that she had conducted herself with impropriety, that she had brought shame upon his household by her willful nature and her unwillingness to submit to righteous guidance. He had never mentioned that the bruises on her arms were his doing. He had never mentioned that he had been the one to grab her in the parlor when she refused to stop writing letters to the county magistrate about the orphan children he kept in his mission house and treated like unpaid labor. He had simply declared her ruined, and the congregation, who loved Elias Croft's sermons with a fervor that bordered on religious itself, had believed him. She had left Wichita with nothing but a head start and a shaking in her hands that took a full week to settle. Caldwell was as far as the money she had managed to save in secret would take her. She stood now in the dust of the main street and assessed her situation with the kind of practical clarity that came from having spent the last 11 days refusing to fall apart. She had $4.30. She had a change of clothes, a small Bible her mother had given her, a hairbrush, and a piece of cornbread wrapped in a handkerchief that she suspected was no longer worth eating. She needed work. She needed a room. She needed to become invisible enough that a man with connections throughout the Kansas territory could not simply reach out and pull her back. She smoothed her dress, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the nearest establishment that did not appear to be a saloon. It turned out to be a general store run by a broad woman named Hattie Combs who had a voice like a wagon wheel on gravel and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Hattie looked at Nora for approximately 4 seconds before she said, "You running from something, honey, or toward it?" Nora considered lying and then decided she was too tired for it. "Running from," she said. Hattie nodded as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world, which, in Caldwell in 1878, it possibly was. "You know how to keep books?" she asked. "Inventory, supply orders, that kind of thing." "Yes," Nora said, because she did. She had managed Reverend Croft's household accounts for 2 years, and she had a head for numbers that the Reverend had found useful right up, until she started using it to document how much money from the collection plate was being funneled into his personal accounts rather than the mission. $2 a week, Hattie said. Room in the back. Meals included. You don't ask questions about things that aren't your business, and neither do I. It was the kindest offer Nora had ever received, and she had to press her lips together very hard to keep from weeping in the middle of a general store in front of a woman she had just met. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me yet," Hattie said. The cot in the back has a spring that digs something awful into the left side. You'll feel it by morning." She did feel it by morning. It was the best night's sleep she had gotten in 3 years. Phineas Morgan arrived in Caldwell 3 days later, driving a cattle herd up from Texas with a crew of 6 cowhands, and the particular brand of exhaustion that accumulated over 800 miles of trail riding. He was 29 years old, lean as a fence rail from 2 months on the trail, and possessed of a quiet that was not the absence of things to say, but rather the considered choice not to say most of them. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that had not seen a razor in 2 weeks, and hands that were permanently calloused from rope work. His horse was a gray gelding he called Fletcher, and the two of them had an understanding about the world that did not require much discussion. Phineas had been driving cattle since he was 16, had worked his way up from trail hand to trail boss by the time he was 24, and had spent the last 5 years working for a rancher named Beaumont Hale out of the Panhandle. He was good at his job in the specific way that people are good at things they were born suited for. He could read weather 2 days out, read cattle the way a school teacher reads print, and read people well enough to know which of his hands were going to cause trouble before they knew it themselves. He was not particularly looking for anything in Caldwell beyond a bath, a real meal, and a bed that was not the ground. He got the cattle delivered to the stockyards by late afternoon, settled the paperwork with the buyer, paid his crew their wages, and watched them scatter toward the saloons with the predictable enthusiasm of men who had been dry for 2 months. He was not a man who begrudged anyone their pleasures, but he did not share the same appetite for whiskey and card games that most of his crew did. He stabled Fletcher at the livery, made arrangements for his own lodging at the boarding house, and then, because he needed supplies for the return journey south, and because it was already past 6 in the evening and most places were closing, he went to Hattie Combs's general store. He came through the door at 10 minutes past 6 and found the store technically closed but still occupied. Hattie was at the counter in the back tallying something, and a young woman he had never seen before was up a short ladder on the right side of the store, reorganizing the upper shelves with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that a task worth doing was worth doing completely right. Phineas was about to excuse himself and come back in the morning when the ladder shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the subtle kind, the left rear foot finding a soft spot in the floorboard, tilting just enough to announce intentions it could not fulfill. The young woman on it grabbed at the shelf, which bought her half a second, and Phineas was across the store in that half second, one hand catching the ladder and the other catching her elbow as she came off it. She did not fall. She landed instead with her feet on the floor and his hand steadying her arm, and she turned around with a look on her face that was startled and wary in equal measure, eyes quickly assessing him the way someone does when they have learned to calculate threat from strangers as an automatic function. He stepped back immediately to give her space, because he recognized that look, and he understood what it cost a person to wear it. "Ladder foot slipped," he said, as if she needed explaining. "Sorry for startling you." She looked at him for a moment and then looked at the ladder and then back at him. The wariness did not leave entirely, but it reorganized itself into something more like assessment. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was careful and even, the voice of someone who had learned to keep their tone neutral. "Phineas Morgan," he said. "Nora Atwood," she said. Hattie Combs appeared from the back of the store with the timing of a woman who had heard the whole thing and was drawing her own conclusions. "Phineas," she said, "figured you'd be in before long. What do you need?" He told her, and Hattie gathered the supplies while Nora came down from the ladder and moved to the counter to record the transaction in the inventory ledger with neat, precise handwriting. Phineas noticed the handwriting. He also noticed the way she positioned herself with the counter between them without appearing to do it deliberately, and the way her shawl sat on her shoulders at an angle that suggested it was doing more than keeping off a chill. He paid for his supplies, said goodnight to Hattie, nodded to Nora, and left, He did not stop thinking about her on the walk back to the boarding house. He came back to the general store the next morning for coffee that he did not particularly need, and Hattie gave him a look that suggested she was not fooled, but she was going to sell him the coffee anyway because business was business. Nora was behind the counter sorting through a crate of dry goods, and she looked up when he came in with the same careful assessment she had offered the night before, only this time there was something slightly less guarded underneath it. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. "Sleep well." "Well enough," she said, and almost smiled. It was the ghost of a smile, a thing that arrived and departed before it fully committed to its own existence, but it changed her whole face in the moment it was there. He bought his unnecessary coffee and sat on the bench outside the store and drank it while the town woke up around him. He had business with the cattle buyer that afternoon to collect final paperwork, and after that he would be free to head south, and there was no reason at all for him to still be sitting on that bench when Nora came out to sweep the boardwalk at 8 in the morning, except that he was. She swept with efficient strokes and did not look at him for a while, and then she said without stopping her sweeping, "You delivered cattle?" "Yes," he said. "Trail boss, Hale Ranch out of the Panhandle." "Long drive," she said. 2 months, he agreed. "You from Caldwell originally?" The broom paused for just a moment. "No," she said. He did not press because he had already understood that whatever she was not saying was something she had good reasons not to say. "Neither am I," he offered instead. "Originally from Georgia, came west at 16. She looked at him then, actually looked, with the kind of interest that people show when they find an unexpected point of connection. "Georgia," she said. "I grew up in Missouri, before Kansas." "Long way from home," he said. "Yes," she said quietly, and went back to sweeping, and he understood from her tone that home was not a word that had a simple meaning for her anymore. He spent the afternoon at the cattle buyer's office and found himself extending his stay in Caldwell by citing the need for his crew to rest before the return journey, which was true enough and also convenient. His crew was perfectly happy with this development. They were significantly less happy when he told them they would be resting for 3 days rather than 1, but they adjusted. Over those 3 days, he found reasons to be around Hattie's general store that were honest enough to not embarrass him when he examined them in the clear light of morning. He helped Hattie move a heavy supply crate that had arrived by freight wagon. He repaired a loose step on the boardwalk out front, borrowing tools from the livery, and spending a focused 40 minutes on a task that most people would have ignored. He brought Fletcher around to let Nora see him because she had, in passing, mentioned that she missed horses, that she had grown up around them in Missouri, and the look on her face when the gray gelding dropped his nose into her palm was the most unguarded thing Phineas had seen from her. "He's beautiful," she said, and she was not talking to Phineas exactly. She was talking to the horse, her fingers moving along the gelding's jaw with a sureness that came from genuine familiarity. "He'd agree with you," Phineas said, "but he's too dignified to say so." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it arrived suddenly and completely, not the ghost of a thing but the full presence of it, bright and warm and entirely unguarded. It lasted only a moment before she seemed to catch herself, as though laughter were something she had grown accustomed to rationing, but the moment itself was remarkable. Phineas felt something in his chest rearrange itself quietly. On the second evening, they sat on the bench outside the store after closing time because Hattie had gone home, and Nora was waiting for the bread she had put in the boarding house kitchen to finish baking. The sun went down in strips of orange and red behind the flat Kansas horizon, and Phineas was telling her about the trail, about the particular quality of silence on the open plain at night when the cattle were settled and the only sounds were the fire and the occasional movement of the herd. "It sounds lonely," Nora said. "It can be," he agreed. "But there's a kind of quiet that's not loneliness, more like being alone with something larger than yourself." He paused. "The sky's different out on the plain. You can see all of it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "In Wichita, the church had a steeple that was taller than anything else in town." I used to think it was meant to make you feel small." He waited because he could feel the weight of what was behind that sentence. "I lived there for 3 years," she said slowly, as if she were releasing something she had held for a long time. "In the household of a man called Reverend Elias Croft. He took me in after my parents died." She stopped, started again. "He was not what he appeared. And when I tried to tell anyone, when I tried to document what was happening to the children in his mission house, he stood up in front of his congregation and told them I was ruined." The words sat in the evening air between them. Phineas did not rush to speak. He let the words settle, and then he said, carefully and with full conviction, "Ruined is his word, not yours." She turned to look at him. The last light was catching her profile, and her eyes were steady and searching, as if she were checking whether he meant it. "He said it like it was a fact," she said. "Men like that say a lot of things like they're facts," Phineas said. "Doesn't make them so." Everyone believed him. "Everyone in his congregation," Phineas said, "which is not the same as everyone." She looked away toward the horizon and was silent for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "The children in that mission house. Some of them were 7, 8 years old. Working from sunup to sundown, never in the school. I wrote 3 letters to the county magistrate. He destroyed 2 of them. The third one got through." She paused. "I don't know what happened after I left. I've been afraid to think about it." "You did what you could," he said, "and then you got yourself out. That's not ruin, that's survival." She pressed her lips together and nodded once, a small and private motion. Then she said, "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you all this." "Because it's been sitting too long," he said simply. "Things that sit too long get heavy." She looked at him again, and this time there was something softer in it, something that was not just assessment or calculation, but the first careful movements of actual trust. They sat together until the dark was full and the bread was done, and when she went inside she paused at the door and said, "Good night, Phineas." He said good night, and he sat on the bench for another 10 minutes looking at the stars over the flat Kansas sky, and he thought about a woman who had been handed a word like ruined and carried it across 11 days of hard country, and about how some things that look broken are actually only bent, and bent things in the right hands can often be set straight. On the 3rd day, a rider came into Caldwell from the north. Phineas was at the livery checking on Fletcher when one of his hands, a young man named Cobb who had a talent for picking up on trouble the way some animals sense weather, came to find him with a look on his face that said the trouble was already here. "Boss," Cobb said, "there's a man over at the saloon asking around about a woman. Dark hair, traveling alone, came in off the Wichita stage about a week back." Phineas was at the general store in 4 minutes. Nora was behind the counter, and she looked up when he came through the door and read his face immediately. The color went out of her cheeks so fast it was like watching a lamp get turned down. "He found me," she said. "It was not a question." "Someone's asking around," Phineas said. "Might not be him personally. Could be someone he sent. Either way, I think we should move you." Hattie appeared from the back with the expression of a woman who had been listening and had her own ideas. "There's a women's boarding house on the far end of town run by a Mrs. Elspeth Garner," she said. "Elspeth doesn't answer questions from men she doesn't know, and she's got 2 sons who feel the same way. I can send word." "That buys time," Phineas said. "But if this man has real reach in the territory, it's only time." Nora had her hands flat on the counter, and she was looking at the surface of it with an expression he recognized now, the same expression she had worn in those first moments when the ladder slipped, that rapid internal calculation of what was real and what she could actually do about it. "I cannot keep running forever," she said. "I have no money to get further than this. I have no one waiting for me anywhere." She said it without self-pity, as a plain accounting of her situation. "You have a job here," Hattie said firmly, "and I am not a woman who lets her employees get dragged off by self-righteous men in collars." "What's the charge he has against you?" Phineas asked. "Legally speaking." Nora shook her head. "Nothing legal. I was his ward. I left. There's no crime in leaving. But he has connections with the county sheriff in Wichita, and he's the kind of man who can make a story stick." She paused. "He could say I stole from him. There was money involved in the household accounts. If he claimed I took it and his friends backed him, it would be a matter of his word against mine. Does he know where you are? Not yet, she said. But if someone's asking about me here, it's only a matter of hours. Phineas thought for a moment, the kind of thinking he did when he was working out a trail route, assessing terrain and variables and possible outcomes. Then he said something that surprised even him by the certainty with which he said it. Come south with us. Nora looked at him. Hattie looked at him. My crew rides out tomorrow morning, he said. We're heading back down into Texas. Beaumont Hale's ranch is 2 months south, but there are towns along the way, proper towns with their own law and their own structures, nothing to do with Wichita or Elias Croft's connections. And in the Panhandle, the range is wide enough that a person can put real distance between themselves and whatever they were running from. I can't simply leave with a cattle crew, Nora said. Why not? Asked, and he meant it genuinely, not as a challenge but as an actual question. She opened her mouth and closed it again, and he could see her working through the logic of it. There would be talk, she said. There's already talk, he pointed out. A man is currently in the saloon across the street making more of it. Hattie made a sound that was unmistakably approving. The man's not wrong, Nora. I don't know you, Nora said to Phineas, and it was the most honest thing she had said since he walked in the door. No, he agreed, and I'm not asking you to trust what you don't know. I'm asking you to calculate your options and make the one that gets you the furthest from a man who has already hurt you. He paused. For what it's worth, I've got references. Hattie's known of me for 3 years through the cattle trade. You can talk to my crew if you like, though I'll warn you that Cobb will talk your ear off and the other 5 will be embarrassingly polite in the presence of a woman. Hattie said, I've dealt with Phineas Morgan's crew twice before and I'm still standing, which is about as good a reference as a body can give. Nora looked at Phineas for a long moment. Whatever she was reading in him, she appeared to find it, if not fully reassuring, then at least not alarming. I would need to earn my way, she said. I won't be a charity case. I wasn't offering charity, he said. I was thinking more along the lines of cook and supply manager, since the man I've had doing both is quitting when we get back to Hale's because his wife has demanded he stop being gone for 4 months at a time, which I consider a reasonable position for her to take. The ghost of a smile again. You're making that up, she said. I am absolutely not, he said. His name is Garrett, and his wife is named Louise, and Louise has made her feelings on the subject extremely clear via 3 consecutive letters that grew progressively less gentle. Hattie had already moved to the back of the store. I'll write to Elspeth, she said, raising her voice, and you can spend tonight there and ride out tomorrow at first light before whoever is asking around figures out where you are. I'll tell him if he comes around here that I had a woman working for me but she went north on the stage 2 days ago. You'd lie for me? Nora asked. Hattie reappeared in the doorway of the back room and said, with absolute composure, Honey, I have been lying to unpleasant men for 43 years. I'm very good at it and I take considerable satisfaction in it. That evening, tucked away at Elspeth Garner's boarding house, Nora sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a room that smelled of lavender sachets and old wood and thought about what she was about to do. She was about to ride south with a man she had known for 3 days and a crew of cowboys she had never met, across 2 months of open country, toward a life that did not yet exist. She thought about the alternative. She thought about Reverend Elias Croft, his absolute certainty in his own righteousness, the way his hands could go from folded in prayer to something entirely different so quickly that she had spent 3 years doubting her own perception of events. She thought about the word he had chosen, ruined, delivered like a sentence from on high, like a thing that could not be appealed. She thought about Phineas Morgan sitting on a bench in the evening light saying that ruined was his word and not hers. She thought about the fact that Phineas had crossed the store in less than 2 seconds to keep her from falling, and that he had stepped back immediately after, and that in 3 days she had not once felt the need to position herself so that there was furniture between them. That last thought felt like the most important data point. She put her few belongings back in her carpet bag, set the bag by the door, and slept better than she had since she left Wichita. The crew assembled at dawn, with the automatic efficiency of men who had been doing this for years. There were 6 of them besides Phineas. Cobb, who was 19 and from Arkansas and talked with the enthusiasm of someone who had never learned that silence had value. A taciturn Mexican vaquero named Esteban, who had been riding with Hale's outfit for 7 years, and who greeted Nora with a courteous tip of his hat. 2 brothers named Thomas and Alden from Missouri who looked enough alike to be disconcerting, and who were, as advertised, almost painfully polite. A weathered older hand named Doyle, who appeared to be held together primarily by stubbornness and tobacco, and a quiet young man named Reef, who had grown up on a Comanche reservation border, and who had an ability with horses that bordered on the supernatural. Hattie Combs arrived at the edge of town before they rode out and pressed a cloth-wrapped package into Nora's hands. Inside was food for the first 2 days, a small amount of money that Nora tried to refuse, and a note that said in Hattie's compact handwriting, "You were never ruined. You were just unlucky, and unlucky can change. Write me when you get somewhere permanent." Nora held the note for a moment, and then folded it carefully and put it inside her Bible alongside her mother's handwriting on the flyleaf. And then she got up onto the horse that Phineas had arranged for her, a steady-done mare named Copper that Phineas had purchased from the livery at what she suspected was considerably more than she was worth, and she rode south out of Caldwell with the Kansas plains opening up around her like something being released. The first days on the trail were an education. Nora had ridden horses growing up, but trail riding was a different discipline entirely, and her body informed her of this distinction in very specific and unambiguous terms by the end of the first day. She did not complain because she was not a complainer, but she was also not able to entirely suppress the look on her face when she dismounted, and Cobb noticed and said, cheerfully, "Don't worry, Miss Nora. By day 4 you'll feel like you were born in a saddle," which she doubted but appreciated. She took over the cooking with a competence that visibly improved the crew's spirits within the first 24 hours. She had cooked for Reverend Croft's household, which had meant cooking for 8 to 12 people on a regular basis with whatever the household budget allowed, and trail cooking over a fire with a Dutch oven and a limited supply of staples turned out to require many of the same improvisational skills. By the 3rd evening she had produced a salt pork and bean stew with sourdough biscuits that caused Doyle to say, without looking up from his bowl, "Best thing I've eaten since Amarillo," which Cobb told her, in a reverent aside, was the highest praise Doyle was physically capable of. Phineas managed the crew, the route, the weather, and the 100 small decisions that keeping 6 men and a woman safe and moving on the open range required. And he did it with the same quiet competence she had observed in the store, that economy of motion and word that was not coolness but rather a very settled relationship with his own center of gravity. He checked on her each evening, not with the quality of a man overseeing a responsibility, but with the quality of a person genuinely interested in how she was doing. "How are you holding up?" he asked on the 4th evening, sitting across the fire from her while the crew settled into their bedrolls. "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "The riding is getting easier, and I like this." She nodded at the fire, the flat dark around them, the immense star-filled sky that she could now see all of the way Phineas had described it. "It gets into you," he said, "the openness. After a while you find it hard to be indoors for too long." "Is that why you've spent 13 years driving cattle instead of settling somewhere?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Part of it," he said. "Part of it is simpler than that. Driving cattle is something I know how to do well, and there's a satisfaction in doing what you're suited for." A pause. "But I won't drive cattle forever. I've been putting money aside for land. There's a piece of ground in the Panhandle that I've had my eye on for 2 years. Good grass, water, decent access." "Your own ranch," she said. "Someday," he said, and there was something in his voice that was both certain and patient, the voice of a man who knew what he wanted and was moving toward it without urgency. She looked at the fire. "I don't know what I want yet," she said. "I spent so long surviving that I never got around to wanting." He looked at her across the fire. "You'll get there," he said. "Wanting is a thing that comes back when you're safe enough to let it." She thought about that for a long time after he said goodnight and went to his own bedroll. The days built on each other the way days do when you are in motion through wide country, each one distinct enough to be its own thing, but also part of the longer rhythm of movement and rest, fire and riding, talking and silence. She learned the crew. Cobb told her his entire life history across 2 days of riding and then began repeating it, which she bore with patience. Esteban taught her 3 words in Spanish per day and tested her on them at mealtimes with a seriousness that she found very funny and very kind. Thomas and Alden turned out to be not as alike as they looked. Thomas was the reader of the two, carrying a battered copy of a Dickens novel that he had read so many times the spine was held together with a piece of cord, while Alden was the one who knew the name of every bird they passed and shared this information enthusiastically and without anyone asking for it. Doyle continued to be Doyle, which is to say largely silent except for opinions about weather, and Reef continued his quiet ministry to every horse in the remuda in a way that made Nora feel better about Copper's well-being than anything else could have. And Phineas. She learned Phineas in the way you learn a piece of country you are traveling through, gradually and with increasing detail, each day revealing something new about the landscape. She learned that he had a way of going very still when he was thinking through something difficult that she initially mistook for inattention, and then recognized as its opposite. She learned that he found Cobb's constant talking genuinely funny rather than annoying, a tolerance that she thought said something important about his character. She learned that he had grown up poor in Georgia, the son of a dirt farmer who had died in the war, and that he had come west at 16 not as an adventure but as a necessity, because there was nothing left to stay for, and the West at least offered the possibility of something different. She learned that he had never been married, not for lack of wanting, but for lack of meeting anyone who made the life he lived feel like something to share rather than something to apologize for. She learned this not because he said it directly but because he said things adjacent to it, in the way that people talk around the center of something important, and she pieced the full picture together from the pieces he offered. She was doing the same thing herself, she realized, offering pieces. The Missouri farmhouse, her mother's patience and her father's laugh, the fever year, the arrival at Elias Croft's door at 20 years old, frightened and grieving and entirely without options. The 3 years of slow erosion, the small encroachments that she had second-guessed herself out of naming until they had accumulated into something unmistakable. The account books, the letters. The last confrontation. She told him about the confrontation on a day when they were riding ahead of the crew by a small distance, checking the trail. She had not planned to tell him, but the horizon was very wide and the day was very clear, and something about the combination of those things made it easier. "He came into the study when I was finishing the last letter," she said. "He knew I had been writing to the magistrate. He had someone watching the post. He came in and he said he was giving me one final opportunity to cease what he called my campaign of malicious falsehood." She kept her voice even. "I told him the letters were not malicious falsehood, they were documented fact, and that I intended to send every one of them until someone in authority paid attention." She stopped. "He showed me what his charity looked like when it was refused." Phineas's jaw was set. He was looking at the trail ahead, but his knuckles on the reins were white. "After that," she said, "he called his deacons, and then he went to the pulpit." They rode for a while in silence. Then Phineas said, "Those children. The ones in the mission house. Did you ever find out if your letter made a difference?" She shook her head. "I left before I could know." "When we reach Tascosa," he said, "there's a newspaper office. The editor there, man named Wills, has a reputation for following up on things that matter. If you want, we could write to the Wichita County records and ask what came of any inquiry. Wills would know how to word it so it gets answered. She looked at him. You would help me do that. Why wouldn't I? He asked, as if the question surprised him. She did not have an answer for that, because the honest answer was that she had spent 3 years in a world where men who presented themselves as benefactors ultimately required a return on their investment, and the idea that a man might simply help without calculation was something she was still learning to hold as possible. "Thank you," she said instead, and he nodded and said nothing more about it, because he understood that the thank you was carrying more than the 2 words it consisted of. Tascosa, Texas, arrived on a day that smelled of coming rain, the air heavy and yellow-green the way it gets before the sky decides to demonstrate its capabilities. The town sat in the Canadian River Valley and was, in 1878, a reasonably lively cattle town with aspirations toward permanence that may or may not have been fulfilled depending on your timeline. It had a courthouse, a newspaper, 2 hotels, and enough commerce to suggest that people planned to keep living there for a while. The crew dispersed for supplies and rest. Phineas kept his word about the newspaper office. He and Nora walked to the office of the Tascosa Pioneer and spoke to a rumpled, ink-stained man named Caldwell Wills, who listened to the summary of what Nora told him with the alert, forward-leaning attention of a journalist encountering an actual story. Reverend Elias Croft of Wichita, Wills said, writing the name down. I've heard the name. He runs a mission charitable operation, yes. I recall a wire story from the Wichita Eagle. He does, Nora said, or he did. The children in his mission house were not students or charity cases being cared for. They were working without wages or schooling under conditions I documented in detail. And you said there was an inquiry prompted by a letter, Wills asked. I believe so. I left before I could confirm it. Wills wrote for another minute and then looked up. I know a man at the Wichita Eagle. I'll wire him today. If there was an inquiry, it'll be on record somewhere. If it wasn't followed up, it should be. He looked at Nora directly. You're willing to be named as the source if it comes to that? She held his gaze. Yes, she said. I am. Phineas watched her say it and felt something in his chest that was not exactly pride but was adjacent to it, the particular feeling that comes from seeing someone who has been told they are nothing decide very clearly that they are something. They spent 2 days in Tascosa. On the second day, Wills came to find them at the hotel with a piece of paper in his hand and a look on his face that said the news was not all bad. The inquiry happened, he said. Your letter got through. The county magistrate opened an investigation in September. Croft's mission was found in violation of county labor statutes. The children were removed and placed with actual families. Croft himself was censured by the Methodist Conference and is currently under investigation for misuse of charitable funds. He paused. He is not in jail, but he has lost his pulpit and a significant portion of his reputation. Nora sat very still and read the paper that Wills handed her. Then she set it down on the table and folded her hands on top of it and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were bright. The children, she said, they're with families. According to the Eagle's man, yes, Wills said. All of them. She nodded and nodded again and pressed her lips together very hard, and Phineas quietly handed her his handkerchief under the table, which she took without looking at him and used with dignity. Thank you, she said to Wills. Thank you, he said back with equal sincerity and went back to his newspaper office to write his wire to Kansas. That evening, the crew ate together at the hotel dining room, and there was a mood around the table that Phineas could only describe as celebratory without having announced itself as such. Nora sat at the center of it, and she was lighter in a way that was visible, the way a field looks different after a long rain. She laughed at Cobb's story about the time he accidentally herded a herd of goats instead of cattle for half a mile before noticing, and the laugh was the full one, unguarded and warm, and Phineas watched it happen from his seat at the end of the table, and thought that he was in significant danger of being entirely in love with her. He had known this was happening for a while. He had been honest with himself about it, in the way that people are honest about things they cannot pretend otherwise about. She was 23 years old, and she had more courage in the set of her shoulders than most men he had ever known, and she had a mind that moved quickly and precisely, and with a kind of honesty that he found almost breathtaking in its rarity. And there was the laugh, the full one. He had to admit, completely done for. What he did not know was whether she was anywhere near ready to hear it. He knew her history. He knew what 3 years under a man who used care as a mechanism of control had done to her sense of what was safe and what was not. And he was not the kind of man who pushed towards something because he wanted it. He understood that the kind of trust she would need to rebuild was built slowly and on evidence, not on declarations, and that the most useful thing he could do was simply to keep being someone who acted the same way whether or not she was watching him. So he did that. He did it through the weeks that followed as they moved south through the Texas Panhandle, through the high, dry country with its red rock and its enormous sky and its wind that never fully stopped. He did it in the small, consistent ways that add up over time, riding ahead to check the water source so she did not have to water copper at a dry hole, bringing her an extra cup of coffee on cold mornings without making it a thing to be noted, stepping between her and a drunk man at a supply stop in the town of Mobedy without creating a scene about it. She noticed all of it. He could tell she noticed because she was a woman who noticed things. It was part of how she had survived, that careful cataloging of behavior and intention, and he could see her slowly updating her understanding of him the way you update a map when you find that the trail is different from what the map said, filling in details, adding nuance, revising the initial rough sketch into something more accurate and complete. She began to talk to him differently. Not less carefully, but in a different register of care, the kind that was not self-protection but genuine attention, the kind of listening that comes when you actually want to hear the answer. On a night when they camped beside a bend in the Canadian River and the rest of the crew had gone to sleep early because the day's ride had been long and hard, she asked him about Georgia. Not the outline she had already heard, but the specific details, what his mother had been like, what the farm had looked like in summer, what had made him walk out of Georgia at 16 and not look back. He told her. His mother had been small and fierce, and had taught herself to read from a single Bible, because there was no school nearby. The farm had been 40 acres of red clay that gave up its crops grudgingly, and only under great effort. He had not walked away so much as been pushed, by the weight of a poverty that had no foreseeable end, and by the knowledge that the West was the one direction in which a man with no money and no connections could still, possibly, make something from almost nothing. "Did it work?" she asked. "It's working," he said, with a small emphasis on the present tense. She was quiet for a moment. The river was going by in the dark with that particular sound of moving water at night, which is both lonely and comfortable depending on who you are. "I used to think," she said slowly, "that I was fundamentally unlucky, that something about me attracted the wrong kind of circumstance. That if I had been different, quieter, more cooperative, less inclined to write letters to magistrates, then things would have been different." "That's what men like Croft want you to think," Phineas said quietly. "I know that now," she said, "but knowing it and feeling it are different things." She paused. "Out here, though, in this," she gestured at the wide dark, "I feel less like something that had things done to it. I feel more like a person who is doing something." "You are," he said. "You have been the whole time." She looked at him across the small fire, and the look she gave him was different from any look she had given him before. It was not the careful assessment of the first days, and it was not the warming trust of the middle days. It was something more direct than either, something that was both question and, he thought, partial answer. He held her gaze and did not look away and did not move toward her because it was not the moment to move toward her, and he knew the difference. She looked away at the fire. "Phineas," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think." She stopped. "I think that I am starting to feel like someone worth something again." Another pause. "I wanted you to know that, because a not insignificant amount of it is your doing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did most of the work on that yourself." "You made it easier," she said firmly, and there was a note in it that did not invite argument. "Then I'm glad," he said simply. She nodded and pulled her blanket around her shoulders and looked at the fire. And after a while she said good night and went to her bedroll on the other side of the camp. And Phineas sat by the fire for a long time looking at the river, and thinking that he was, in fact, the luckiest man in the state of Texas, which was saying something considerable given the amount of competition. Hale Ranch came into view on a day in late November, the grays going brown with the season and the big sky pressing down on it with a quality of light that was particular to the Panhandle at that time of year, clear and cold, and absolutely unforgiving in the distances it revealed. The ranch was a substantial operation, a main house, a bunkhouse, barns, corrals, and the particular organized sprawl that comes from years of incremental growth. Beaumont Hale was a man of 60 who moved like someone 20 years younger, and who greeted the returning crew with the businesslike warmth of an employer who respected good work, and showed it in practical ways. He greeted Nora with the assessing look of a man accustomed to sizing up situation quickly, and then he looked at Phineas, and Phineas gave him back a look that said this is not something that requires explanation right now. And Beaumont Hale, who had been reading people since before Phineas was born, nodded once and shook Nora's hand, and said he understood they needed a cook for the house since his current arrangement with a woman in Tascosa had just ended, and if she was interested the position was hers. Nora said she was interested. She settled into Hale Ranch with the same thoroughness she had brought to Hattie Combs's general store, making herself useful in ways that extended past the explicit job description, bringing organization and attention to the house kitchen that transformed it within a week, and making friends with the ranch hands in the gradual way of a person who gives trust in proportion to what is earned rather than wholesale. She wrote a letter to Hattie Combs telling her where she was and that she was well. She received, 3 weeks later, a letter back from Hattie that said she had successfully misdirected Croft's man, and that the news from the Tascosa Pioneer had been picked up by the Wichita Eagle and was causing, in Hattie's words, considerable and long overdue consternation in certain sanctimonious quarters, which Nora read aloud to Phineas with a satisfaction that she did not bother to hide. The weeks at Hale Ranch were a settling. Phineas had the winter work of the ranch, the fence repair and equipment maintenance, and the 100 tasks that needed doing when the cattle were not being driven, and Nora had the house, and they found themselves at the edges of each other's days in the way that people do when they occupy the same space with a shared ease, morning coffee and evening meals, and the occasional conversation in between. The crew treated her as simply a part of the operation. Cobb had appointed himself her unofficial assistant in all things, which meant she regularly had a running commentary accompanying whatever she was doing, and she had developed a genuine affection for him that she expressed by feeding him larger portions than anyone else, which he had noticed and appreciated enormously. Esteban tested her on her Spanish every third day and expressed satisfaction at her progress with the gravity of a professor reviewing a doctoral candidate. Reef had shown her the best way to care for Copper's hooves in the dry Panhandle air, and she reciprocated by making sure he always had the first and largest piece of whatever she baked, because a man with that gift for horses deserved the best piece of pie as a matter of principle. December came in cold and sharp, and the prairie went silver with frost at night. On a Sunday afternoon when the ranch was quiet, and Beaumont Hale had driven into Tascosa for business, and most of the crew had gone along, Nora and Phineas were sitting on the porch of the main house with mugs of coffee and the particular companionable silence they had developed over months of each other's company. He had been working up to something for 3 weeks. She knew he had been working up to something for 3 weeks because she had learned to read the quality of his silences, and this one had been freighted with intention. "Nora," he said. "Phineas," she said, I have something I want to say, and I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plain and not circumference." She turned to look at him. The winter light was very clear and cold, and it picked out every detail of his face, the weathered lines, the dark eyes, the steadiness that she had come to rely on without ever making the conscious decision to do so. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been in love with you since considerably before I had the sense to fully admit it to myself. I'm not telling you because I expect anything in return. I'm telling you because you've spent a long time in the company of a man who kept his real motives hidden, and I decided a long time ago that I would never be the kind of man who does that, so." He paused. "There it is." The prairie was very quiet. A hawk was circling over the far end of the pasture, its wide circle patient and unhurried. Nora held her coffee mug in both hands and looked at the hawk for a moment and then looked at him. "I have been afraid," she said carefully, "of exactly this. Not of you, of my own response to you. Because I know what I feel, and I also know that I spent 3 years learning to distrust what I feel, and the two things have been in considerable argument with each other." He waited. He was very good at waiting. "The side that knows what it feels," she said, "has been winning." A small pause. "For a while now, fairly decisively." He looked at her. "Yeah. Yes," she said, and she met his eyes directly, without the old guard in them, and what was in them instead was clear and decided and warm. "You have been the most consistently good thing that has happened to me since I can remember. And I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it out of need. I say it because it is accurate, and I have a fondness for accuracy." He set down his coffee mug, and he took her hand gently, in the same way he had held the ladder, and then a different way entirely. She looked at their joined hands and then at his face, and she leaned forward and kissed him softly, with a deliberateness that left no room for ambiguity about who had made the choice. He kissed her back with both hands held carefully to her face, as if she were something worth being careful with. When they broke apart, the hawk was still circling, patient as ever, and the prairie lay around them in its silver December light, and she was still holding his hand, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on anyone before and recognized immediately. "Well," she said, slightly unsteadily. "Well," he agreed, in a voice that was considerably less steady than his usual, which she found deeply satisfying. She laughed, the full one, and he laughed with her, and they sat together on the porch in the cold, clear afternoon and eventually retrieved their coffee mugs. And nothing in the world was the same as it had been before, except all of it, and yet all of it was better. Christmas at Hale Ranch was a quiet affair by most measures, but a warm one by all the ones that mattered. Nora made a roast and 3 kinds of pie, and Cobb ate, until Doyle told him to stop embarrassing the species. Beaumont Hale gave each of his hands a modest bonus, and shook Phineas's hand with a look that communicated a great deal without needing words. Someone, probably Esteban, produced a guitar from somewhere, and there was music after dinner that went on for 2 hours and became increasingly cheerful as the evening advanced. Phineas had saved, quietly, for a small piece of jewelry from the trading post in Tascosa. It was not grand, a simple silver ring with a small turquoise setting, but it was real, and it was chosen with care, and he gave it to her that night after the rest of the crew had dispersed, when they were washing up the dishes together in the kitchen in the lamplight. He held it out in his palm without ceremony and said, "I am not asking yet, because I think asking properly requires a few more months and a better ring. But I wanted you to have this so you'd know I'm serious about the asking when it comes." She looked at the ring in his palm, then she looked at him. Then she picked up the ring and put it on her right hand, 3rd finger, because the left would be for when it was time, and she said, "I have been serious about the answering for a while," and he folded his hand over hers and held it. Winter moved toward spring with the particular stubbornness of panhandle winters, which do not go easily and require persuasion. In January, there was a stretch of cold so sharp that the water in the troughs froze overnight, and the crew had to break it every morning, and Nora made double portions of everything hot, and was regarded by the hands as something approaching a benevolent deity. In February, a letter arrived from Wichita. It was addressed to Nora Atwood, care of Hale Ranch, Tascosa, Texas. The return address was the office of the Wichita County Magistrate. She held it for a moment before she opened it, standing in the kitchen with the envelope in her hand, and then she opened it. The letter informed her that the investigation into the operations of Reverend Elias Croft's charitable mission had been concluded. The mission had been formally dissolved. Croft had been found liable for misappropriation of charitable funds and ordered to repay a substantial sum to the county charitable board. He had additionally been banned from operating any charitable or educational organization within the county in perpetuity. He had entered into this agreement without contest, which the magistrate noted suggested the extent of the evidence against him made contest unviable. He had left Wichita. His current whereabouts were unknown. There was a second paragraph that addressed Nora directly. The magistrate wished to inform her that her letters had been instrumental in the initiation of the inquiry. The documentation she had provided regarding the children in the mission house, specifically the records of their labor, the absence of any educational provision, and the discrepancy between the charitable funds received and those demonstrably spent on the children's care, had formed the evidentiary backbone of the case. The 8 children formerly in Croft's care were all placed with families in the county, and per the most recent follow-up, doing well. She was invited, if she was ever in Wichita, to come to the magistrate's office, as there was some question of a small monetary restitution that the county felt was owed to her as a former ward whose status had been misrepresented. She read the letter twice. Then she went out to the barn where Phineas was working on a broken piece of fence equipment, and she read it to him out loud. When she finished, he set down the equipment and looked at her with a fullness in his expression that she had come to know as his version of strong feeling, contained but present like water that is still but deep. "He's gone," she said, "and the children are safe." "Yes," he said. She folded the letter with great care and put it in her pocket next to where she kept her mother's Bible. "I'm not the same person who walked off that stage in Caldwell," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're more." She went to him, and he put his arms around her in the barn with the smell of horses and hay and winter cold all around them. And she held on to him, and let out a long breath that she felt like she had been holding since September. And he held her steady and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the holding did not already communicate. Spring arrived finally, spectacularly, the way spring arrives in the Panhandle after a hard winter, with a sudden extravagance of green and wildflowers that makes you forget the cold ever happened. The cattle operation ramped back up, and Phineas began preliminary conversations with Beaumont Hale about the land he had been eyeing, a section of ground about 12 miles northwest of the ranch that had good grass and a reliable creek, and had been sitting idle because its previous owner had moved his family to New Mexico. Hale was encouraging. Phineas had saved enough for a down payment, and Hale, who had built his own spread from almost nothing and respected that trajectory in a younger man, was willing to extend some credit on the rest and let Phineas work it off over time. It was the kind of arrangement that depended entirely on trust and reputation, and Phineas had both in sufficient quantity that Hale made the offer without visible hesitation. On a warm April evening when the creek on the property was running high with snowmelt, and the grass was the particular green of early spring, Phineas took Nora out to see the land on a Sunday ride. They rode side by side, and he did not say much as the land opened up around them, letting her see it, and she did not say much either for a while, and then she said, "Tell me what you see here." "House there," he said, pointing at a slight rise near the creek with a view in 3 directions. "Barn south of it, corrals here. Good fence line runs natural along that ridge." He paused. "Enough land to run 200 head to start, more eventually." She looked at the rise where the house would go and the creek below it and the wide open grass around it. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's a start," he said. "It needs a lot of work to be what I can see it being." She looked at him. "I can see it too," she said simply. He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a ring. Not the small turquoise ring he had given her at Christmas, but a different one, gold with a small diamond setting, modest but real and clearly chosen with consideration and effort. "I told you I'd ask properly," he said. "And I wanted you to be standing on the land when I did, so you'd know exactly what you were saying yes to." He looked at her steadily. "I am asking now. Not because I need you or because you need me, but because I want to share this with you and I want you to be the person I build it with." He paused. "Nora Atwood, will you marry me?" She was looking at the ring and then at him and then at the land and then back at him, and her eyes were very bright in the spring afternoon. "Phineas Morgan," she said, "you have been asking me that question in ways that were not technically the question since the moment you caught that ladder. And the answer has been yes since considerably before you asked." He slid the ring onto her left hand, and she held it up and looked at it in the spring light, and then she leaned across from Copper and kissed him, and Fletcher shifted politely to the side as if accommodating the moment, and the creek ran below them in the green grass, and the sky was enormous and blue and completely full of possibility. They were married in June, in Tascosa, in a small ceremony performed by a justice of the peace who was not a preacher, and who did not have opinions about Nora's history or anyone else's. Beaumont Hale was present and appeared to be in excellent spirits. Cobb cried, which he denied afterward with great vigor. Esteban was very dignified and brought flowers. Thomas and Alden stood side by side as though they were a set piece, entitled supportive coworkers. Doyle wore a clean shirt, which was his version of an elaborate gesture. Reef brought a small carved horse that he had made from mesquite wood and gave it to Nora without explanation, which was the most he had said about his feelings about any situation in 2 years. Hattie Combs sent a letter from Caldwell that arrived 2 days after the wedding, and that contained a piece of cloth from her store, a bolt of blue calico, along with a note that said, "For the new house. I figure you've earned curtains." They moved onto the land in July, living initially in the existing structure on the property, a modest one-room affair that had belonged to the previous owner, while Phineas began the work of building what would eventually be the real house. He did much of it himself, with help from the Hale Ranch crew on weekends, and it went up through the late summer and fall with the steady accumulation of a thing being built properly rather than quickly. Nora managed the domestic side of the operation and the accounts, the latter with a precision that Phineas found genuinely useful and that she clearly enjoyed, and she started a kitchen garden that was not yet producing much but that had the look of something with intentions. She learned more of the cattle operation than her job required, not because she was asked to, but because she was interested, and her interest was the kind that translated into actual competence with surprising speed. In the evenings they sat on the porch of the small house and watched the Panhandle sky go through its colors, and they talked, the way people talk when they have nothing to hide from each other and no agenda except the pleasure of the other person's company. They talked about what the ranch would look like in 5 years. They talked about the trail, the specific things he missed and the specific things he did not. They talked about Missouri and Georgia and the long roads that had brought them both to this particular piece of ground in the Texas Panhandle, and about how strange and specific and completely unplanned the route had been. "If I had not been on that stage to Caldwell," she said one evening, "if I had not needed supplies that evening," he said, "if the ladder had not slipped," he smiled, "I think we would have found each other anyway," he said, "one way or another. The world seems organized that way for some people." "That is a very romantic position for a cattle rancher to hold," she said. "I'm a man of unexpected depth," he said with full seriousness. She laughed, the full one, and leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And the evening went on around them, warm and full of cricket sound and the distant low of cattle and the smell of the first frost coming in from the north. and everything was exactly as it should be. The new house was finished by late autumn of 1879, a proper two-story structure with a real kitchen and a parlor and 2 bedrooms and a porch that faced southwest to catch the evening light. Nora stood in the kitchen on the first morning in the new house and looked at the space with a feeling that it took her a moment to name, and then she named it. She felt at home. Not safe the way a locked door is safe, not sheltered the way a person is sheltered when they have found temporary cover, but actually at home, in the way that means a place that belongs to you and that you belong to in return. She had not felt that since she was 20 years old in Missouri, before the fever took her parents and sent her out into a world that had not been gentle with her. She let herself stand there and feel it fully, without qualification. Then she made breakfast, because feeling things was important and so was feeding your husband, and these were not mutually exclusive activities. The spring of 1880 brought a development that neither of them had discussed in explicit terms, but that both of them had, in their private ways, hoped for. Nora was pregnant. She discovered this in March and told Phineas in the kitchen in the morning, directly and without preamble, as was her way with all important information, and the look that went across his face was one of the finest things she had ever seen on another human being, a sort of total transparency of joy that he made no effort to moderate or contain. He came around the table and held her, and she felt his hands very carefully on her back, as if she were something extraordinary, which she supposed she was. They both were, in the ordinary extraordinary way of people who had been given something they wanted badly enough to be genuinely astonished by its arrival. "A boy?" he asked. "We'll see," she said. "I have no particular opinion either way." "Neither do I," he said with the sincerity of a man who genuinely meant it. "You're shaking," she observed. "I know," he said, not embarrassed by it at all. She wrote to Hattie. She wrote to the magistrate's office in Wichita, which she had been in occasional correspondence with since the settlement of the Croft matter, to inform them of a change of circumstances. She did not write to anyone else because there was no one else to write to, and she found, sitting with that fact, that it did not make her sad the way it once might have. She had Phineas. She had this land. She had, in the unconventional and completely genuine way of people who find their family in the people they have chosen rather than the ones they were given, a collection of cowhands and a woman in Caldwell, and a journalist in Tascosa, and a cattle rancher named Beaumont Hale, who had quietly made sure that her first winter on the Panhandle had included a supply of firewood that was considerably in excess of what she had ordered, without anyone mentioning it. In November of 1880, she gave birth to a boy. Phineas was present, because that was what she wanted and what he wanted, holding her hand through 12 hours of labor with the focused steadiness that characterized everything he did. The baby arrived in the early morning hours, screaming with a conviction that suggested he had opinions about his new circumstances and intended to make them known. They named him James Beaumont Morgan. James for Phineas's father, who had died in the war when Phineas was 9. Beaumont, without asking Beaumont Hale first, because the name felt right and because when Beaumont Hale heard it, 3 days later when he drove out from the main ranch to see the baby, he turned away for a moment and appeared to be doing something with his face before he turned back, and Phineas pretended not to notice, and Nora pretended not to notice, and Hale cleared his throat and said James was a fine name and a fine boy, and he was clearly going to have opinions about everything, which was a family trait apparently, and everyone found a reason to look at the baby rather than at each other for a moment. James Beaumont Morgan did, in fact, have opinions about everything, which were expressed at volume in his first months, and with increasing verbal specificity as he grew. He had Nora's dark hair and Phineas's eyes and what appeared to be both of their stubbornness, compressed into a small body with what seemed to Cobb, who visited when he could, to be a fundamentally unreasonable amount of personality for a single baby. The ranch grew. It grew the way things grow when they are tended by people who know what they are doing and who care about the outcome, not explosively but steadily, with the kind of progress that accumulates into something substantial over time. By 1882, they were running 300 head. They had added 2 full-time ranch hands and a barn that was considerably larger than the first one. The kitchen garden had grown into something approaching a proper kitchen garden, and Nora had added a section for herbs that she used both for cooking and for a sideline in remedies that the neighboring ranch families had begun to seek out with increasing frequency. She had also, at the suggestion of the teacher at the small school that had been established in the nearest town, begun teaching reading to the 2 ranch hands who had not had the opportunity to learn, an arrangement that took place in the kitchen on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and that both men participated in with a mixture of embarrassment and determination that she found deeply moving and never mentioned in terms that would increase the embarrassment. "You can't help yourself," Phineas said one evening, watching her set up the lesson materials on the kitchen table. "What do you mean?" she asked. "The children in Croft's house," he said. "The ranch hands now. You see people who have been denied something they need and you can't not try to provide it." She considered this. "Is that a criticism?" she asked. "It is not," he said with complete sincerity. "It's one of the things I love most about you." She looked at him across the kitchen and he looked back at her, and the moment had the quality that many of their moments now had, a depth and an ease combined, the comfort of people who know each other fully and find what they know good. "James is asleep," she said. "I know," he said. "The lesson is not for another 40 minutes, she said. "I know that too," he said, and came around the table. In the spring of 1883, Nora found herself pregnant again. She was 30 years old, and this time the pregnancy was easier in its first months, and she went about her business with the same efficiency as always, with Phineas watching her with a care that she accepted without argument, because she had finally, over the course of 5 years, learned to receive care from him as simply a part of how they loved each other, not as something to be suspicious of or to guard against. This time the baby was a girl, born in December, healthy and loud, and possessed of an expression of absolute determination from her first moments. They named her Clara Ann Morgan. Ann for Nora's mother, whose Bible still sat on the shelf in the parlor next to a small framed letter from the Wichita County Magistrate's office that had arrived 2 years before, addressed to Nora Morgan and thanking her formally for her role in an inquiry that had materially improved the lives of 8 children, a letter she had framed not out of vanity, but because her mother had always said that written evidence of a thing well done was worth keeping. James, who was 3, regarded his sister with the mixture of fascination and suspicion common to firstborn children confronted with the arrival of a second, and spent the first month in a state of watchful assessment before deciding, apparently, that she was acceptable and that he would allow her to remain. Cobb visited that Christmas and held Clara with the careful reverence of a man entirely unused to babies and trying very hard to do it correctly. And Nora watched him from across the room and thought that he was going to be someone's wonderful father someday, and she hoped he found the right person soon. By 1884, the Morgan Ranch was a settled, functioning, genuinely prosperous operation in the Panhandle, not wealthy in the way of large Texas fortunes, but comfortable, solid, the kind of prosperity that comes from good land and good management, and 2 people working toward the same thing with their whole attention. Phineas had added a proper office for the accounts that was Nora's domain, and that she kept with the same precise, organized hand that she had brought to every ledger she had ever touched, and occasionally on evenings when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, she would sit at that desk and look at the numbers and feel a satisfaction in them that went beyond what numbers usually produce. She knew what those numbers meant. They meant security. They meant that no one could take this from them, not a preacher with a pulpit or a man with social connections, or the kind of poverty that had shaped both her early life and Phineas's. They meant James had a school to go to, and Clara would have one when she was old enough, and the ranch hands who worked for them had fair wages and a place at the table and access now to reading lessons that two of them had completed, and one had taken so far beyond the original intention that he was working through an almanac and a history book, and had started reading to James in the evenings, which Phineas said was the most unexpected and delightful development he had witnessed in 5 years of ranching. On a September evening in 1885, Nora sat on the porch of the house she had helped build on the land she had helped build into something, with James asleep upstairs and Clara asleep in her cradle that Phineas had made from mesquite wood in the style of Reef's carved horse, for sentiment, and Phineas beside her in the other chair, and the panhandle evening going out in every direction in that particular October quality of light that made everything look clean and final and very good. She had a letter in her lap from Hattie Combs, received that day, that said Hattie was doing well, that Caldwell was changing as the cattle trade routes shifted, but that the general store was still standing and still hers, that she had taken on a new employee, a young woman from the west of Kansas who had arrived with a carpetbag and a split lip and an immediate talent for inventory management, and that she hoped Nora was well and that the children were growing and that the ranch was everything it had looked like it might be. Nora folded the letter and held it. "Good news?" Phineas asked. "Hattie took in another woman who needed help," she said. He nodded. "Sounds like Hattie." "It sounds like the best kind of person," Nora said. The evening went quiet around them. In the distance a coyote made its statement to the rising moon, and the cattle in the far pasture were a low, steady sound that Nora had grown so accustomed to that she only noticed it now as a kind of comfort, the sound of the ranch breathing, the sound of what they had built going on existing in the dark. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked, not specifying what it was because she did not need to. "About how it started," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Regularly," he said. "I think about a woman climbing a ladder in a general store in Caldwell, Kansas, and I think about what would have happened if I had not needed supplies that evening. I would have found my way to somewhere," she said. "I was not going back." "I know," he said, "but I'm glad it was here." He paused. "I'm glad it was me." She reached across and took his hand, the same hand that had steadied her on the ladder 8 years ago, calloused and strong and entirely familiar, the hand of a man who had never once in their years together raised it to her in anything other than gentleness. "Ruined," she said quietly, testing the word the way you might press on a bruise to discover whether it still hurts. It did not hurt. It had not hurt for a long time. It was simply a word that a frightened, controlling man had thrown at her to keep her from speaking, and she had carried it for a while, and then she had set it down somewhere on the trail south and kept going. "Do you know what I think ruined means?" Phineas said, in the voice he used for things he had actually thought about. "What?" she asked. "I think it means the original plan got interrupted," he said, "and for some plans that's a loss. But for some plans, the original plan was never one you should have been asked to follow in the first place, and the interruption is just the beginning of where you actually needed to go." She looked at him in the September evening, this man who had once told her that ruined was his favorite kind of rebuilt, and she thought about what she had been before and what she was now, and about all the specific and unlikely things that had been required to get from one to the other, and about the 2 children asleep inside, and the land around them and the ledger on her desk, and the letters from Hattie and the letter from the magistrate and Esteban's patient Spanish lessons and Reef's carved horse that sat on the parlor shelf, and the blue calico curtains from Hattie's store that still hung in the parlor, because she had put them up the first week in the new house, and had never seen a reason to change them. "I love you," she said, because it was true, and she said true things when they were relevant. "I love you," he said back, with the full weight of everything those words had accumulated over 8 years of being meant. They sat together until the stars were fully out and the coyote had made its peace with the moon, and the panhandle had gone entirely silent in the way it sometimes did, a silence so complete and clean that it felt like the world had taken a breath and was simply resting, satisfied for a moment, with how things had turned out. Inside, Clara shifted in her cradle, some small dream making itself known. Nora heard it the way mothers hear the sounds of sleeping children, that specific attentiveness that is always partly awake. She squeezed Phineas's hand and rose and went inside. He sat for another moment, looking at the stars over the land that was theirs, listening to the sound of his wife moving through the house they had built together, listening to the quiet, which was not empty but full of everything that had been built and earned and grown here. And he thought, as he often thought in moments like this, that the road from Georgia to Kansas to Texas, the long road of a life that had not been easy and had not been sure, had brought him here to this porch, to this land, to this woman and these children and this life that fit him exactly the way a good saddle fits, not confining but freeing in the way that having the right thing in the right place always is. He got up after a while and went inside, where the lamplight was warm and Nora was at the cradle and Clara had settled again, and James's soft breathing came down from upstairs, and the house was exactly what it was supposed to be. He stood in the kitchen and looked at his wife in the lamplight, and she looked back at him, and everything between them was said and settled and ongoing, the way the best things are. He blew out the lamp. The dark outside was full of stars. Everything was exactly right.